The Ravenwood Plaza. My parents bought the inn when I was 3. It had been their lifelong dream to open and operate their own inn. Mom, who had worked as an electrician before she met my dad, would handle the inn's maintenance. Dad, who had a degree in hospitality management, would deal with the guests and work the front desk. When my brother Jared and I got older, we worked there too. At least, until the accident. The inn was only 2 stories, 3 if you count the basement, but Mom had insisted on building an elevator. Dad had argued that an elevator would put them over budget and wasn't necessary. Mom argued that it would be better for disabled and elderly guests, and that they could afford it if they abandoned plans for a tennis court. In the end, she won, and worked her butt off until we had a working elevator. It was pretty small. The maximum occupancy was 10 people, but 4 people would have a hard time squeezing in there. This was mainly because the elevator shaft had once been a chimney. Mom had wanted to expand it a little, but Dad had put his foot down. To make it seem bigger, the walls were floor-to-ceiling mirrors, and the carpet was a friendly, warm red. Despite its size, the opening day guests had seemed to like it. 3 years after the inn opened, tragedy struck. Jared was 10 years old when the construction of the inn ended, and 11 when the inn opened to the public. He and I had a lot of fun living there. There were new kids to play with every weekend, a pool to swim in when it was hot, and, of course, an elevator for us to goof around on. We constantly got in trouble for doing things in there, planting rubber spiders to scare guests, jumping on it and shaking the car, acting like it was about to fall, etc. No matter how much trouble we got into, we always had fun on that elevator. I guess that's why Jared was so insistent about using the elevator to get to the basement that night. He was 14, I was 10. We had all been watching a cheap horror movie on TV when we heard a thud from the floor below. Our apartment was on the 1st floor. The thud came from the basement. I was jumpy from the movie, but was trying not to show it. Mom and Dad, however, were concerned. Who was messing around in the basement? Jared said he'd check it out, and grabbed a flashlight. Other than a tiny window near the ceiling, the basement didn't have any light. It was where we kept gardening tools, holiday decorations, spare parts, and virtually anything else we didn't need. I had a healthy fear of it throughout my childhood, but I tried to go with Jared. He didn't seem worried, so there must not have been anything to worry about. He realized I was following him when we were halfway down the hall. "What are you doing?" "I want to help." I'd tried to sound braver than I felt. From the look on Jared's face, I failed. "Go back and watch the movie. It's just a big rat or something. I can handle it." I nodded sadly, but relief washed over me. It was storming that night, and I was afraid of lightning. The thought of dealing with both of my greatest childhood fears at once had been almost too much to bear. Still, I watched him walk to the elevator. I can still see him now, clear as day. He'd been wearing a red and black checked flannel shirt, with the sleeves cut off. He thought it made him look like Bruce Springsteen. blue jeans so faded that they were almost white, and his favorite black work boots. He turned around and waved at me before the doors closed. "Don't eat all of my popcorn," he called out. I nodded, smiling as the doors closed. Then, a rather loud thunderclap shook the building, and I ran for Mom. She comforted me with more popcorn and a can of soda. We sat for a few minutes, watching the movie and waiting for Jared to come back. Then, a few more minutes. Then, a few more. When an hour had passed, Dad turned off the TV and went to go check on Jared. He came back with a wide-eyed expression and sweat on his shirt. He told Mom to call the cops. The source of the noise we'd heard was a mole that had gotten into the basement by mistake after falling through the window, which the gardener had mistakenly left open while trying to let a breeze in. Dad had seen the intruder before it had seen him. Moles have lousy eyesight. Caught it in an empty shoebox and sent it back out the window. Once he'd closed and locked it, he started calling for Jared. No response. He'd called up the stairway, even though Jared rarely used it. Again, nothing. Dad pressed the button to call for the elevator. He heard the machinery working, but he thought for a second that it sounded like someone pounding on the doors to get out. He shook it off as his imagination. Then, the doors opened. For a second, he saw Jared. Not standing in the center of the elevator, but reflected in every mirror. His eyes wide in terror and his mouth wide in an eternal scream. Then Dad blinked, and he was gone. The elevator doors closed. Dad had waited too long to get in. But Dad didn't feel like using the elevator anymore. He was sweating buckets, his eyes brimming with tears, and he didn't even know what he'd just seen. But he knew one thing. Jared had never gotten to the basement. The cops showed up later, after Mom had made me go to bed. Through eavesdropping, I learned the facts. Jared wasn't anywhere, in or outside the inn. There were no signs of a break-in. The basement window was too small for anything bigger than a house cat to get through, and there were no witnesses to what had happened. All I could tell them was that Jared had gotten into the elevator. The inn was closed for investigation, and all of the guests left. Mom and I temporarily moved in with Grandma, while Dad stayed at the inn to help the police. After 3 weeks, they had no choice but to give up. There were no leads, no suspects, not even a body. He was just gone. It was a hard time for my family. I loved Jared. He was my role model, my hero. There was no funeral because there was no way to prove that Jared was really dead. For all anyone knew, he'd simply taken the elevator to the top floor instead of the bottom, sent it back down, taken the stairs, and walked out the front door when no one was looking. The police had considered this theory, but didn't make sense. Being happy there, why would he run away? Other theories had been bounced around. A kidnapper pretending to be a guest had snatched him, going outside and getting attacked by an animal, etc. The inn was completely shut down. My parents couldn't stand to look at it anymore. Mom took up a new job as the chief electrician at an office building, while Dad became a tour guide at the local history museum. They always tried to smile around me, but I could tell that they were still hurting. You don't sob yourself to sleep every night if you're fine. I stayed with Grandma a lot that summer. She was a sweet lady, and I loved her, but she was kind of boring. All she ever wanted to do was read long, boring books and watch black and white movies. Luckily, she always fell asleep in the mid-afternoon and gave me enough time to sneak outside. Grandma only lived a mile away from where the Ravenwood still stood, and I visited pretty often. Maybe I wanted closure. Maybe I just wanted to feel nostalgic, or maybe I half believed that Jared would still be there. I didn't really know. I'm still not sure. The last time I ever went to the inn was 2 years after the disaster, and a month before my parents and I left the state for good. And I had just learned that we'd be moving a literal 100 miles away, and I was sad. I told them that I was going to visit Grandma and ran to the inn. I sat on a crumbling stone bench in the overgrown front garden, and I wept. If Jared were here. I kept thinking those words, but nothing came after them. Maybe we wouldn't have moved away if he were here. Or maybe we would have already moved. I didn't know. But I did know that I wanted him back. Julie. I heard my name. I wiped my eyes and looked around. The garden was dead, minus the wind stirring some of the dead branches. Who said that? It almost sounded like, "I'm here, Julie." There it was again. There was no mistaking it this time. It was Jared. I smiled, even though my heart rate tripled. Was he alive? Had he just been hiding here the whole time, waiting for us to come for him? Please, help. I whirled around until I saw him. He was standing in the front entryway, beckoning to me. He looked exactly as I remembered him. A 14-year-old boy wearing a sleeveless flannel shirt. I hesitated. Then I ran to him. He must have darted back inside, because the doorway was empty when I got there. I looked at the inn's interior from the doorway. What had once served as the lobby was bare and dirty. The furniture and decorations had all been sold, leaving nothing behind but an ugly, lone pillow in the corner. One sniff, and I could tell that the entire building had become a breeding ground for rats and other such creatures. Hardly the place I remembered. Julie, please. That time, his voice came from up the stairs. I didn't feel good about this, but I kept trying to find him. If he was still alive, then it was up to me to bring him home. I scrutinized the old wooden staircase. It didn't look safe. When I tested the first step, it groaned and practically sagged under my boot. Julie! He sounded panicked. Was he hurt? I gave the stairs a second look. They didn't look too bad. Maybe if I ran? Julie! He screamed for me, and for a moment I wondered how a human being could make such a noise. I gave up trying to safely get up the stairs and just ran for it. I made it up to the 10th step when the wood gave way. For a second, I felt as if the ground had turned to quicksand, and before I could blink, I was stuck on the stairs, with my top half still on the stairway and my bottom half dangling in space. It knocked the wind out of me, and I tried to catch my breath. Julie! He needed me. I had to get out. I looked around for anything that I could use to pull myself up. There was the banister, but it was now out of my reach. In anxiety and frustration, I slammed my fist onto the stair before me. It practically exploded at my touch and sent pieces of stair down to the floor. I was startled. Then I noticed that I had just made myself the perfect handle. The top part of the stair was gone, but the wooden framing around it remained. I grabbed it, and using all of my strength, I lifted my legs out of the hole and swung them onto the only unbroken stair in front of me. It groaned as I put my weight on it, and for one terrible second, I thought it would turn to dust like the last one, but it didn't. I used the banister to pull myself upright and practically leapt up the rest of the stairs. I sat to catch my breath and examined myself. My hips were covered in scratches and splinters, and my ankles and boots were covered in spider webs. I thanked the Lord that my jeans were tucked into my boots. Julie, I turned around, standing in the elevator door, wearing a red and black checked sleeveless flannel, and his favorite boots, was my brother. Only he looked different, thinner. What happened to you? It was all I could get out, but it seemed the right question. I was a lost little boy. The elevator, the portal, showed me my way. The words were in his voice, but I don't think his lips were moving. I took a closer look at him. Not only was he skinnier than I remembered, he was paler, too. But I'm so lonely. Sister, take the elevator. You are lost. Portal will show you the way. He took a step toward me, and I realized what I should have known all along. Jared was dead. He was probably dead the second he got into the elevator that night. The thing talking to me wasn't Jared anymore, because its skin was falling off right before my eyes. I did what any rational child would do. I screamed and ran. Jared was faster than I expected, but I'd always been able to outrun him before. Still, he was right behind me. I was almost to the front door when a strong hand grabbed the back of my jacket and pulled me backwards, nearly off of my feet. To the portal! There was nothing human left in his voice. I was screaming, I was crying. Then I realized something. It had me by the jacket, but my jacket was unbuttoned. I didn't waste time. I slipped out of it and bolted out the door. I heard a scream of rage and surprise as I fled, but I didn't look back. Not once. I just kept running until I got home. I told my parents. They believed that I had been to the inn and fallen through the stairs. The scrapes, splinters, and cobwebs were evidence of that. But they didn't believe that Jared had become a ghost. They believed that I'd fallen asleep there and had a nightmare, realizing that it was probably better if they didn't know the truth. I agreed. 3 days before we moved, a farming supplies company offered to buy the land that the inn sat on. They told us they wanted to build a warehouse there and that they'd need to destroy the inn. My parents agreed and signed the papers that day. A week later, while we were still unpacking boxes, my mom got a call from the very perplexed construction foreman. He wanted to know what she'd made the elevator shaft out of. No matter what they did, they simply could not destroy it.